And welcome back to Heavier Than Heaven by Charles L. Cross. Is it Charles L? Charles R. Cross. Excuse me, the big Jewish writer he is. Yeah, bred to you by Bradley Dobrik in 2024. Also going to try to not totally copy Media G-Town NW Studios, but going to definitely give some more of my own opinion on this book here compared to the last. Because the last book I would have to say by Hank Harrison, I felt not much need to correct or give much of my own opinion because I wanted to do something more straightforward than all this extra stuff. So we're at the prologue. New York, January 12th, 1992. Heavier Than Heaven is the slogan used by British concert promoters to describe Nirvana's 1989 tour with the band Tad. It summed up both Nirvana's heavy sound and the heft of 300-pound Tad Doyle. Alright, the first time you saw heaven came exactly 6 hours and 57 minutes after the very moment the entire generation fell in love with him. It was remarkably his first death and the earliest of many little deaths that would follow. For the generation smitten with him, it was almost an impassioned, powerful, and binding devotion. The kind of love that even if it begins, you know that it's preordained to break your heart and end like a Greek tragedy. It was January 12, 1992, and a clear but chilly Sunday morning. The temperature in New York City would eventually rise above 44 degrees, but 7 a.m. in a small suite of the Omni Hotel, it was near freezing. The window had been left open to air out the stench of cigarettes, and the Manhattan morning had stolen all the warmth. The room itself looked like a tempest had engulfed it. Scattered on the floor with randomness of a blind man's rummage sale were clumps of dresses, shirts, and the shoes toward the suite's double doors stood about half a dozen serving trays covered with the remnants of several days of room service meals. Half-eaten rolls, rancid slices of cheese littered the tray tops, and a handful of fruit flies hovered over some of the wilted lettuce. This was not the typical condition for a four-star hotel room. It was the consequence of some of the warnings of the housekeeping to stay out of the room. They had altered a pages stick together when a book gets old like this. The do not disturb sign to read do not ever disturb. We're fucking. There was no intercourse this morning. Asleep in the king-size bed was a 26-year-old Courtney Love. She was wearing an antique Victorian slip, and her long blonde hair spread out over the sheet like the tresses of a character in a fairy tale. Next to her, in a deep impression in the bedding, where a person had recently lain, like the opening scene of a film noir, and there had been a dead body in the room. I woke up at 7 a.m. and he wasn't in bed, remembered Love. I'd never been so scared. Missing from the bed was a 24-year-old Kurt Cobain. Less than hours earlier, Kurt and his band Nirvana had his musical act on Saturday Night Live for the very first time. Their appearance in the program would prove to be a watershed moment in the history of rock and roll, and the first time a grunge band had received live national television exposure. It was the same weekend that Nirvana's major label debut, Nevermind, knocked Michael Jackson out of the #1 spot on the Billboard charts, becoming the best-selling album in the nation. While it wasn't exactly overnight, Nirvana had taken the industry by surprise. It was unparalleled. Virtually unknown a year before, Nirvana stormed the charts with their Smells Like Teen Spirit, which became 1991's most recognizable song, its opening guitar riff signifying a true beginning of the 90s rock. And there had never been a rock star like Kurt Cobain. He was more of an anti-star than a celebrity, and refusing to take a limo to NBC and bringing thrift store sensibility to everything he did for Saturday Night Live. He wore the same clothes from the previous 2 days. A pair of Converse tennis shoes, jeans, big holes in the knee, a t-shirt advertising an obscure band, and Mr. Rogers-style cardigan sweater. He hadn't washed his hair for over a week, but dyed it with strawberry Kool-Aid, which made his blonde locks look like they had been matted with dry blood. Never before in history of live television had a performer put such little care into his appearance or hygiene, or so it seemed. Kurt was complicated, contradictory, a misanthrope, and at times appeared to be an accidental revolution, showing hints of a careful orchestration. He was professed in many interviews to detest the exposure he had gotten from MTV, and yet repeatedly called his managers to complain that the networks didn't play his videos nearly enough. He obsessively and compulsively planned every musical career direction and writing ideas out in his journals years before he executed them. Yet, when he was bestowed the honors, he had the thought and acted as if it were an inconvenience to get out of bed. He was the man of imposing will, and yet equally driven by a powerful self-hatred. Even those who knew him best felt they knew him already, hardly knew him at all. All the happenings of Saturday morning would attest to that. After finishing Saturday Night Live and skipping the cast party, explaining it was not his style, Kurt had given a 2-hour interview to a radio journalist, which finished at 4 o'clock in the morning. His working day was finally over. In any standard, it had been exceptionally successful. He headlined Saturday Night Live. He had seen his album hit number 1, and Weird Al Yankovic had asked permission to do a parody of Teen Spirit. These events, taken all together, surely marked an apogee of his short career, the kind of recognition most performers only dream of, and that Kurt himself had fantasized about as a teenager. Growing up in a small town in the southwestern Washington state, Kurt had never missed an episode of Saturday Night Live and had bragged to his friends in junior high school that one day he would be a star. A decade later, he would be the most celebrated figure in music. After just his second album, he had been hailed the greatest songwriter of his generation. Only 2 years before, he had been turned down a job for cleaning dog kennels. But this pre-dawn hours, Kurt felt neither vindication nor a need to celebrate. If anything, the attention had increased his usual malice, and he felt physically ill, suffering what he described as a recurrent, burning, nauseous pain in his stomach made worse by stress. Fame and success only made him feel worse, and Kurt's fiancée, Courtney Love, were the most talked about couple in rock and roll. Though some of the talk about the drug use was actually drug abuse, Kurt had always believed that recognition for his talent would cure many emotional pains that marked his early life. Becoming successful had proven the folly of this, and an increased shame that he felt about his booming popularity coincided with an escalating drug habit. In a hotel room in the early hours of the morning, Kurt had taken a small plastic baggie of China white heroin, prepared it with a syringe, and injected it into his arm. This itself was not unusual, since Kurt had been doing heroin regularly for several months, with Love joining him in the 2 months they had been as a couple. But particularly this night, as Courtney slept, Kurt had recklessly or intentionally used far more heroin than was safe. The overdose turned his skin to an aqua green haze and stopped his breathing. He had made his muscles stiff as coaxial cable, and he slipped off the bed, landed face down into a pair of clothes, looking like a corpse, haphazardly discarded by a serial killer. It wasn't the OD'd, Love recalled. It wasn't that he OD'd, Love recalled. It was that he was dead. If I hadn't woken up at 7, I don't know. Maybe I sensed it. It was so fucked. It was sick and psycho. Love frantically began resuscitation efforts and would eventually become a commonplace for her. She threw her cold... Jeepers creepers, he overdoses and they're making it like Courtney Love was gone through the most shocking thing in the fucking world, and I bet she'd overdosed more than him at this point. Love frantically began resuscitation efforts and eventually became commonplace for her. She threw cold water on her fiancé and punched him in the solar plexus so that it would make his lungs begin to move air. When her first actions didn't get a response, she went through a cycle like a determined paramedic working on a heart attack victim. Fuck that. I bet she was doing her makeup and not giving a fuck that he was fucking dying on the floor. She was probably just wishing she was married to him. Finally, after several minutes of effort, Courtney had a gasp signifying Kurt was breathing. Once again, she continued to revive him by splashing water on his face and rubbing her pussy lips all over his lips, moving his limbs also. Within a few minutes, he was sitting up and talking, and though still very stoned, wearing a self-posed smirk, almost as if he were proud of his feat. It was his first near-death overdose, and it had come to this very day. He had become a star. In the course of one singular day, Kurt had been born in the public eye, died in the privacy of his own darkness, and was resurrected by the force of love. It was an extraordinary feat, implausible and almost impossible. But the same could be said for so much of his outsized life, beginning with where he come from. You really act like you're a gallivant talker, Charles. That's all I got to say so far. So that's the end of the prologue. And I guess we'll see you in chapter 1, Yelling Loudly First. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.